Whitney?
That was good. I don't know what happened. As soon as they're not.
I've heard.
I removed the nails.
Oh. I know, but we're taking the hit here. It's too close.
It is.
I mean, I would feel like.
Row back. Well, you know, me. I have to spend some money.
And we're blocking.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy the nobody message I sent you? No. So her daughter played it.
I don't know. That's been here since this morning.
Woman who played that role was so amazing. She made it so real. I couldn't believe it. And so it was like this was part of his reflection. So I inserted the part about how great she did and such a her daughter. It's like.
And you'll let us know. You'll let.
The comments were so funny. So she used pictures of herself and her siblings as her children. Oh, this scenario. So the student was like, "Your kids look so much like you." Yeah, because that's me. And then one of them was like, "Your eldest looks like they're a really good, like, big sister, and that she's the eldest." So it's like the comments they're making with no knowledge that they're commenting on the person. I mean, you're so fun to watch, knowing like, I mean, she also just enjoyed when they're like, "Oh, your eldest seems like a really good big sister." She's like, "Oh, yes, she is." My eldest is something special.
She loved it. I'm sure she loved it.
I know, I'm going to call her up to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
great. Okay, perfect. Yeah. Wait just a minute. It's been such a delight to have conversations over the past few months.
No, and I'm glad we're doing it in conversation because I feel like, you teach so you know, but the more, I think it's kind of the basis of the Socratic method is to have more conversation and get some people's names and more interesting.
Just when I saw like it's just this event, like okay, freedom of speech and it's just always like they or at least we rile us a little bit more about here. So
I'm sure that Connolly, what's his name, is the same.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Paul Van Arsdell Jr. Memorial Lecture on Litigation and the Legal Profession. A triple Illini, Paul Van Arsdell was a partner at Latham & Watkins in Chicago. He was an outstanding litigator in consumer law and was regarded by his colleagues as a very hardworking attorney and mentor. He became the youngest head of the firm's finance committee, a demonstration of the firm's deep respect for him and his work. The law firm of Latham & Watkins, the Van Arsdell family, and many friends, colleagues, and clients endowed this memorial lecture series to promote thoughtful discussion on litigation, dispute resolution systems, and the highest ethical ideals of the legal profession. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Yasmin Cader to the College of Law. The format of this talk will be slightly different, with Yasmin and I in conversation, answering questions, including those that have been submitted prior to this event. There will also be a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience. Yasmin Cader is a Deputy Legal Director and Director of the Trone Center for Justice and Equality at the American Civil Liberties Union. The Trone Center encompasses the ACLU's work on criminal and racial justice. A proud graduate of Howard University and Yale Law School, Yasmin credits her education and experiences at these institutions for inspiring her to pursue a career as a civil rights litigator and public defender. She began her career as a judicial law clerk to the Honorable Damon Keith of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and quickly established herself as a visionary practitioner on the front lines of the fight for racial justice. She has held roles at the Employment Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, the Federal Defense in the Southern District of New York, and the Federal Public Defender Office in Los Angeles. Prior to joining the ACLU, Yasmin was a co-founder of Cader Adams Trial Lawyers, a women-owned litigation boutique in Los Angeles. At Cader Adams, Yasmin litigated high-stakes civil and criminal matters and counseled higher education, nonprofit, and for-profit institutions seeking to transform organizational culture and enact systems to advance intersectional racial justice. Yasmin currently lives in Los Angeles and is deeply involved with her community. She serves on the LA Board of Police Commission's Advisory Committee on Building Trust and Equity, and Los Angeles Unified School District's Superintendent's Reimagining School Safety Task Force, focusing on the role of police in public schools. Yasmin is also a leader in several programs devoted to racial justice work on a national level. She is a member of the Opportunity Agenda Steering Committee, amplifying voices and narratives that change how the public perceives and understands systemic inequities and oppression in the criminal legal system. Passionate about mentoring and training law students and public interest lawyers, a note to all of you out there thinking of these areas, she is involved in Gideon's Promise, the National Criminal Defense College, and Harvard Law's Trial Advocacy Workshop. Yasmin is also Vice President of the Yale Law School Association Executive Committee, a member of the Leadership Advisory Council for the Psi Leadership Program at Yale Law School, and a fellow with the American College of Trial Lawyers. Please join me in welcoming Yasmin Cader to the College of Law. That was. So you got some background, some context. So Yasmin, what made you decide to work in the field of civil rights and focus on the criminal justice system?
Well, here's the truth. I did not plan to do so. In fact, I was a graduate of Howard University, and when I was there, I had the privilege and the honor of studying political science, and I studied a lot in Frederick Douglass Hall. So, there was, immersion of just the concepts of Frederick Douglass's commitment to civil rights and to the Constitution and to the First Amendment. And so that was in my bones. But when I went to law school, one of the things they asked us to do was to write a letter to yourself of where you will see yourself in 10 years and what you're going to be doing. And I knew that I was going to be doing amazing policy work. Marian Wright Edelman was a big mentor of mine, just in terms of looking at her career and being, admiring what she had done with the Children's Defense Fund. And that was something that I wanted to emulate. The two things, though, that I knew that I wasn't going to do was I wasn't going to be a litigator, I wasn't going to be a civil rights lawyer, and for sure I wasn't going to be a public defender, because I wanted to do big things and make major changes. Is this working? Is it too loud? No? Okay. Make major changes, so that wasn't what I was going to do. And then life happened, and fate happened, and I got really sucked into it. When I was clerking for Judge Keith, the opportunity came to work in the honors program of the Civil Rights Division at Justice, and I said, well, I'll do that. I'll just try it, and I'll see what it's like. And so I went, and I was a civil rights lawyer, and I worked on employment discrimination cases, both in the disparate treatment context and the disparate impact context, and it was really exciting. But then something happened, and I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I had friends who were working down the street from where I was, from the Justice Department, in Superior Court, in the local courthouse. And what was happening was this was the apex of the war on drugs, and really kind of the crescendo in many ways of mass incarceration. And I just felt pulled to that which seemed to be really the front line of the civil rights movement. And again, I said, okay, well, I'm just going to try this and do a little bit of it. And then, 23 years later, of a career as a public defender. So the moral of my story is I didn't plan, but I was called.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the cases that you've handled and some of the unique features of the many different roles that you've had over the course of your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be honored to. So when I started off in the Justice Department, again, we were working on employment discrimination work and looking at employment discrimination in the context of cities and municipalities. So we did a combination of disparate treatment cases as well as disparate impact. So I remember very well, I had a disparate treatment case in Picayune, Mississippi, of a teacher who was African American, who had applied for advancement, and despite meeting all of the credentials, she passed the tests, she had the prerequisites, she had done and gotten all of the evaluations along the way of excellence, did not advance. And then we looked at what was happening in terms of also evidence of hostile work environment. She was being called names. She was there were signs being put up with racial slurs. She was in a really difficult, challenging place, and she decided to bring a lawsuit of disparate treatment. And for me, it struck me, when I went to meet her, and we actually settled the case because the evidence was so strong, what it took for her to ultimately bring that claim, because it really was the end of her career there. When she made that decision, she tried so hard to make it work. And when she finally came in, and I think as litigators, you see this, when disputes end up in litigation, often it is such a failure of a resolution. Litigation is in many ways the least effective way to resolve a conflict. But so that struck me of what it took for her to come to that point. And while she prevailed, everyone in many ways lost the opportunity of having her be able to advance and make a career. The other case in that context that struck me I did was a disparate impact case, and we were looking at Torrance in California, and it was employment discrimination in the police and fire departments. So there were standardized tests that had a disparate impact on Black and Latino applicants, and there was such a desire and a need in those areas to be able to diversify their workforces. You know, I think it's something that now, how many decades later, there's much more of an understanding of the need for policing to be a diverse workforce, and a need for policing to have people from the communities that it serves, but also from a variety of communities to have more fair outcomes. But there were these structural impediments to that. So that was an impactful case for me. But then when I became a public defender, there were so many cases and so many people and so many stories that I had that were really meaningful. And I can just talk about a couple of them.
Yeah.
All right. So, you know, when I was in D.C., when I started my career as a public defender, again, it was really that crescendo moment of the war on drugs, and I represented so many people who really the victims of that. And the victims of the war on drugs were not just people who were accused of crimes related to drugs, which really just dramatically increased the sentences that people were looking at, but it was everyone in the criminal legal system, because those sentences that came from the war on drugs were increased for everyone, as well as was the system of just over-criminalization. I represented so many people in this context, and part and parcel of the criminal legal system and what happened from mass incarceration, but also what happened in how the criminal legal system in many ways has a history of being a weaponization of racial oppression, was dehumanization. And so I represented children. I started off with representing children, and, you know, including, I had a child who was accused, because police were put in schools, things that were normally disputes or normal adolescent behavior got criminalized. I represented a child who was accused of assault with deadly weapon ketchup for a food fight, right? So, you know, which is just absurd. But I also, you know, I also represented a child who was found to be involved and was involved in a felony murder. And while he was my client, he was then transferred to adult court and served a sentence of 23 years. And I am still in touch with him, and he has been released in the last 7 years. But watching him and the circumstances that brought him into a life where he felt like he really didn't have a lot of choices, how he got, you know, caught up into a drug deal that went bad, and then as a child sentenced to what was really the equivalent of a life sentence. His name was Colleen Flowers, and I remember him so well, because as soon as he was sentenced, he became a scholar. And he spent all his time in the law library, and he watched and really became a partner in the evolution of the law for everyone, because he looked and studied the law and saw the sentence that he was facing, and then also watched the law evolve in terms of the recognition of childhood, adolescent development and brain development. And while there was a very famous case called Miller, which changed the idea that you could execute children, because we have adolescent brain development where the prefrontal cortex doesn't happen until the mid-20s, yet children were being treated as adults, even though the science showed that they didn't have that cognitive recognition for the mens rea, the necessary. So he was watching this happen in the context of capital punishment, and really he personally helped for the law to change in the context of life without parole. And he reached out to Brian Stevenson, who is a famous scholar who really helped bring this evolution of this knowledge of child development to the law. And he helped secure his own liberation finally and change the law in D.C. on the structure that he had been sentenced under to become, to be found and validated, and then secured his own release. And since then, he is a world-renowned artist, and he travels the world. And I just saw him a month ago at a fundraiser for a reentry program. And so that's someone who I'll never forget.
So you have these cases and relationships that clearly you carry and stay with you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the lessons that you carry with you from your experiences over your career, and I'm sure for the future trial lawyers in the audience. Kind of what do you think are the skills and the outlook that you need to be a successful trial lawyer?
Well, I'm gonna tell that again through another story of a client. I represented people post 9/11 when there were roundups in New York. I was there, and there was a real kind of abandonment, I would say, of our principles. I would say that there's a retrospective analysis of that, both in terms of the torture of individuals in Guantanamo Bay, but something that wasn't really as publicized was that they were rounding people up in New York City in post 9/11 time, just because they wanted to find out anything they could about anything that might be related to terrorism. And it wasn't a logical connection. It was just like, oh, are they Muslim? Are they in a mosque? Let's find a charge where we can bring them in and then question them. What are you hearing in the mosque? I mean, it was that unsophisticated. It was that lack of targeting in terms of actual information to lead to something that would be potentially harmful from a national security perspective. So I learned a lot about the role of emotion and fear in how it can how it can sway us from our principles. I also learned in the course of the work that I did the importance of fidelity to principle. I represented someone who was accused of 2 different homicides while in prison, and he was also a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. And he was, a very proud member of it, and then he got me as a lawyer. And he was someone who I can say I learned so much from, and he learned so much from me, and it was such an honor for me to represent him. It was, again, for me, the fidelity to principle, as you can imagine, because I believe so much in the Sixth Amendment. I believe so much in our Bill of Rights, that representing him was not just, an unfortunate thing that I had to do. It was an honor, and it was a real walking the walk, and I believed so much in these principles and that they should apply to everyone. So to your question of how do I approach the work and what did I learn from the journey, I really learned, I think, such a deep respect for our founding documents, such a respect for the genius of our principles in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, in the separation of power, reckoning with, the obvious, some would say hypocrisy, some would say, duality of our founders, many of whom were at the same time espousing liberty and justice and equality while they were engaged in one of the original sins of this country, of slavery, and themselves, some of whom were slave owners, or at least espousing the 3/5 compromise, and so I think that what I gained was a deep respect for how principle can still exist in a context of compromise, and how it can endure, and how principle can endure, and the application of those principles to people who were the least regarded was something that I really appreciated as a public defender. I think the other thing, though, if they're just as a really practical matter for the budding litigators and other lawyers that I experienced was just in addition to humility, in addition to curiosity, preparation. Just as a tactical matter, I mean, you know, I was often, when you're a public defender or you're a civil rights lawyer, you are going into battle with a real disparate resources. You know, you would think that public defenders and district attorneys or U.S. attorneys are paid the same. They're not. You would think that the offices have equal resources for a good adversarial system. They don't. But what no one can take away from you, if you are going, you know, if you are an underdog or if you're not, no one can take away from you your passion, and then no one can take from you your preparation. And one thing that I feel very proud of is that every time I stood up on behalf of anyone, and I will say consistently with the work that I help lead now, no one will ever out-prepare me, ever. No one will ever outwork me, and no one will ever be more humble than I am and ask for help at every stage. And so I might not have, you know, the weight of society on my side, but I will outwork everyone.
Take note. All you 2 L's and 3 L's and 1 L's. So I wanted to just go back a minute and talk about this idea of kind of principled commitment to rights and their protection. And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, you've illustrated kind of what it meant, right, to defend the rights of everyone, even if it's not someone who views you as an equal necessarily on first blush, or with whom you're in deep disagreement. Why do you think that matters? Why is it important?
You know, I'm a linear thinker. Whoa, I went to law school. But, you know, when you think of the rules of the road and you think of kind of the concept of our democratic state, that's why I think it matters. I think that, you know, again, going back to the design of the system that we have, the design of the rule of law, the design of the separation of powers, both in terms of the judicial branches, but also in terms of federalism and the distribution of power, I think it matters to not just combat tyranny, but to achieve these goals that we have of a flourishing multicultural democracy where we are accessing the talent and giving the opportunity broadly to as many people as possible. But what that requires is standing up on it even when it isn't the beliefs for which you yourself may agree. And so, shocking that I'm now at the ACLU, right? And what the ACLU is often famous for is both advocacy for values that I would say, you know, the membership espouses themselves, but also principle that are where you're advancing speech or you're advancing the values of the speaker, even for values that you don't agree with. So, you know, there's the famous Skokie case that I'm sure people are familiar with, that is famous ACLU case. What isn't as famous is how controversial it was at the time for the ACLU to take that case. And, you know, there's dispute over whether this is true, but of myth is that at least 1/3 of the membership just lost when the ACLU stood up for the permit for a white supremacist Nazi group to march through a Jewish neighborhood in Skokie. But the lawyer who did it, who himself was Jewish, talked so much about, if we don't do this now and protect these speech rights of these individuals, it's not going to work for the values and the speech of those with whom we agree. It's a, as my grandmother would say, good for the goose, good for the gander analysis. And there's a deep critique of that. And it's a critique from a standpoint of a power analysis, which is we're not all on a level playing field. It isn't the same. You know, racist or white supremacist rhetoric has a harm that is so, you know, it's not a colorblind analysis. It's not a neutral principle. And I understand that critique. That said, I still believe in the principle, and likely because of my work as a public defender and seeing the importance of the Fourth and the Fifth and the Sixth Amendments to apply to everyone. And so I think that is part of the lesson for me. You know, we have but it's not without an analysis of the harm. You have to hold both to be true at the same time. We recently represented last term the NRA in a case which there was a very rare, 9-0 majority in that case where it was a question of government speak. Government speech, and it was a question of whether after the Parkland, massacre, there was a movement across the country to really on government actors who were, to enact a form of, fair regulation of the gun industry where they could. But they went in our opinion, in the court's opinion, it's nice when you win, in New York they went too far. And in terms of not just using the bully pulpit of the governor's office and the comptroller to say, we do not agree with this, proliferation of guns, but so far as to really threaten the gun industry's ability to get insurance and to be audited and regulated because of the speech, because of what they were espousing, not because of any other legitimate business reason. And, we took that case, they asked us to take that case because they know of our principled stance, and it is so applicable to so many things. I mean, all you can imagine for areas which we promote. For example, abortion rights, if they're going after a Planned Parenthood and saying in, a conservative state, we're going to attack your ability to get insurance. We're going to attack your ability to be regulated fairly in the financial context. It has to be principled and it has to be fair. And sometimes the law is tested at the most on its margins, and that's where we stand. So I don't see, it is not black and white, it is nuanced, it is gray, but for me, I think that at the foundational core, if we don't have these principles that we can stand on, then we don't have much.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about, I'm going to push you a little on the challenges, right? Sure. So we have the importance of kind of for our democratic self-conception of maintaining a principled commitment to rights. And you talked about the critiques that you find compelling. You understand where they're coming from based on power analyses and the controversy that taking a principled stance can generate. So what for you is the most challenging part of being and maintaining a commitment to principle, both in the public defender context and in the ACLU context? Keeps you up at night or makes you think, well, maybe I'll, be a little unprincipled. Once in a while. But just kind of what is the worries that you...
So I came here directly from Montgomery, where I was just these last few days. I was there for Jubilee, for the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which was, as you recall, really the movement that generated the Civil Rights Act. And when John Lewis crossed the bridge, and there were 3 marches that happened, and those marches, as were after Martin Luther King met with President Johnson, and President Johnson says, I just don't have the political will to make this happen, to pass the Civil Rights Act. And he said, and it was funny, I heard Andrew Young tell this story, who was with Martin Luther King. They left, and Andrew Young, he was like so angry at President Johnson, and Martin Luther King said, we're going to help him out. We're going to help him out. We're going to give him the political will. And that was the strategy of Selma and Bloody Sunday. So being there was, as you can imagine, especially now, very moving and very important. And I was with my children, and we took the drive from where the marchers marched, and we were along the highway, and there was a commemorative plaque of the march in the middle of the highway, but my husband stopped, and he said, let's go back, because I want to take a more careful look at that plaque. And when you looked at the plaque, and the plaque was relatively new, there were bullet holes all through it, right? Recent bullet holes all through it. And, you know, watching right now the violence and the threat of violence for, you know, our what seemed to be solid agreement of the need for civil rights protections, being there in the heart of that struggle, you know, it's contextual. You have to face the context. And yet, what those freedom fighters and those freedom marchers were fighting for was this democratic, you know, principles for the right to vote, the right to participate, the right for the democratic state to work. So I think that when you think of the power of white supremacist speech, you know, the executive order that came down seeking that we censure South African liberation in many ways, that one hit me. That one hit me hard. Just because it seems like there's such a movement away from what was such a mainstream agreement, you know, that we had. And that is speech, right? And so that is something I wrestle with. But you know what? Let me just tell you who I go back to. So Frederick Douglass died in 1895. So a year before he died, he gave a speech. And we just have to put this in context. He watched emancipation. He watched Reconstruction. But then he also watched post-Reconstruction vitriol, lynching, codifying of Jim Crow, the enslavement through convict leasing, just the regression and the vitriol from progress and seeming, you know, movements upward to extreme, you know, turning back. And he gave this speech in which he said, and I paraphrase very crudely, damn. In which he said, you know, I look and I see, you know, just this, what seems to be the failure of this country to live up to its ideals, the consistent hypocrisy, and I despair. It makes me wonder, can this ever live? But then I remember and I think back and I reckon to the time when the country was founded and when all of these authoritarian, undemocratic regimes worldwide were shaking in their boots at the concept of these United States and of this land of not a king, but of a democratic state, and this anti-authoritarian participatory experiment. And when I think back to what was going on at that time, that gives me the hope. That gives me the belief that this experiment will work, and maybe not in my lifetime, but that it's worth fighting for. If he could do that, if John Lewis could stand firm, then there really isn't a lot for me to question.
So that ties this to a long question we got. And so I'm just going to read it. Yeah. And it's about kind of inviting you to say more about hope, especially when it feels infertile, as this question is asking. So the question is, our criminal justice system has had multiple criticisms throughout U.S. history. In fact, a lot of lawyers choose to change their career path due to the emotional toll of being part of the justice system, including a toll of defending someone you may believe to be truly guilty, the content and severity of the crime, or the legal loopholes that continue to break the justice system. However, without efforts to update the justice system will increasingly fail more people. So you can talk about that, like the context and then what experience or quality do you think is most crucial to develop a mindset that allows one to continue pushing for needed renovations and reform of our justice system, even when hope feels infertile?
Okay, I love that question. There's so much to unpack. I want to just start, though, with some assumptions that are in it that I don't necessarily agree with. So representing somebody who you know is guilty. Oh my goodness, that's the job. And I think it is very counterintuitive, and I'm so glad that the person raised that, because it's not just counterintuitive for those who are outside of the system, it's counterintuitive for prosecutors, for judges, and for public defenders. Many people who work in this system don't understand the very rules of the road. And that under the Sixth Amendment and under the right to counsel, the job and the role of the defense lawyer is a really narrow one. It is to represent zealously your client. And what that means is that you're not trying to figure out what really happened. You're not trying to determine what is the right or the just thing that should occur ultimately, but you are focused on that one person and making sure that you are using the rules of evidence, holding the government to its burden and providing a zealous defense, representing their rights under the Fourth Amendment, representing their rights under the Fifth Amendment. That's your job. It's small, it's narrow, it is very, very limited. And so, do I think my clients were guilty? A lot of the time. Did it matter? It was irrelevant. My job was to hold the government to its burden. And those three principles of burden of proof, of presumption of innocence, of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, those were the flag that I waved and stood on and gave me very clear, it's a very clear black and white, analysis. However, what the question raises that I think is really interesting is the role of the government, which is much more complicated. My friends and colleagues and friends across the aisle, as we would say, had a very different job. Because as a prosecutor, your role is to think about what is the good for the community as a whole. Is this case in what should be the right sentence here? Is this the case to be brought? Is the public defender doing their job? That's part of the prosecutor's role, is to make sure that the public defender is doing their job. And if they're not, to raise their hand and say, this is not justice. But so many times in our adversarial system, that becomes lost. And part of the reason I know that is because I was a civil prosecutor. I worked at the Department of Justice, and I was trained very much that you represent the United States. You are not an advocate. And so I'd love to remind my friends who were criminal prosecutors of that shared understanding and belief. But the other part that I think is in a really important analysis in this question is when these systems fail. And, and when I say that, we have systems right now where we have public defenders who have 200, 400 cases. You can't provide someone with the defense that they deserve. The system is failing in that context. And we also have underfunded, DA's offices where they can't feel that they are meeting the need or the desire of what they want, even though often they're more, when you find that, you're going to find the underfunding of the public defense to be much different. But, I understand the premise of the question of how do you keep going when you have this ideal and you have the reality which is so far from it. I understand that, and many could give up. And many do, because it almost feels like you're perpetrating a fraud. I understand that, but I believe that our job is to not give up, but to continue to point out the failures where we're not meeting what we espouse to meet. I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
At least for me. I don't know if you do.
Well, I would love to engage with whoever has that question more, too. Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple more, two more questions that I have, and then we'll open up for questions that you all have. But let's turn to the current moment and the current administration. And we see a flurry of administrative actions and a number of lawsuits that are being filed contesting the legality and lawfulness of some of those administrative actions or orders, and a number of which are challenging civil rights and liberties. And so So how do you think about right now, our current moment?
You know, we had a really interesting conversation earlier today with a group of students, and you know, one of the things that I think is so important for us to remember is whatever movement space we're in. If we're, you know, call ourselves, you know, members of the left, or members of the right, or members of the Democratic Party, or members of the Republican Party, there's so much diversity within those areas and thought. And I'm turning right now to a lot of the critiques that are on the right of the right. And what I'm hearing and what is making sense to me is, again, this is not normal. And this is what we're seeing is an attack on, again, the foundational principles. And before we even get to civil rights and civil liberties, the concept of the separation of powers and the exaggeration of executive power in this moment. Now, there's definitely different schools of thought about, you know, how strong that executive power should be and how much it should not. But there seems to me to be not a principled pushing of the envelope, but really a real abrogation of that concept. And so a lot of the response to what's happening with executive orders or administrative actions that are really just outright violating well-held principles, birthright citizenship, you know, again, separation of powers issues, the 14th Amendment, in other contexts, you know, our established civil rights laws, you know, and most importantly, I would say our First Amendment rights is not a genuine effort to test the law and push the law and see where the boundaries are, but a real kind of fiat. And so that is of great concern to me, the velocity, the seeming strategy of you know, shock and awe, of overwhelm. That is very troubling to me. And what is equally troubling to me is the position that so many actors are put in of having to decide whether they're going to follow the law or have to self-censor themselves and engage in action lest they be at the other end of the government's finger and face retribution. You know, there's several DEI orders. We could just focus on the one radical indoctrination. You know, that is forcing, and you know, you're seeing schools, Department of Defense schools, taking down books off the shelf, posters of Harriet Tubman, you know, canceling the Women's History Month, you know, programming, not because that's what the law says or even there any clarity from the vague memorandum, but because they feel, they're the vague executive order, but because they feel that they must do this lest they'd have their budget cut, right? That's not principled. That's not in good faith. It's in bad faith, in my mind, in the pressure that is being put on in institutions. The attack on the law firm Perkins Coie, the attack on Covington Burling, the attack on, you know, major mainstream institutions, on universities, you know, that is of trouble to me. However, I believe there is a great deal of opportunity in this crisis, and that is the opportunity to bring seemingly disparate factions together and bring us back to one, right? In terms of what do we actually all believe in and what do we want and what are our principles of democracy that we want to protect together. So there's talk about reaching across the aisle, far reaching across the aisle, and a coalition of one that we haven't seen in decades, if not centuries, of people who are being, I believe, really unfairly persecuted, to come together to stand on what are the principles that we agree upon.
So my last question is, how do you do this all, in a way? But it is, you know, so we had conversations leading up to today talking about the themes that would shape our discussion. And one of the things that we talked about was the importance of being a full person and having a full life. Valuing and investing not just in your career, but in relationships with family and friends and partners and children, and with organizations and activities in your community and outside of it that you find really fulfilling. So just in hearing your biography and talking about the demands now that and the priorities that we all confront, how do you think it's possible to have a full life in this sense, or what makes it manageable or impossible for that matter?
You know, there's a lot of talk that people have of self-care, and I bristle at it, and it's probably because of my age. It's a generational problem that we have of our generation. But there's a lot to be learned, I think, from younger generations about just how interwoven, frankly, your sense of self is with your work. And your ability to be a full person to move forward. And one of the lessons I'm learning is it's not a bifurcated process. It's actually one and the same. And so when we can bring that more into the forefront in the workplace and be open about whatever it is that we have and respectful, that makes a big difference. So for example, my boss the other day, this is going to make you laugh. So she said, listen, you have to slow down. I'm telling you, we're having conversations at night when you're at soccer practice. You know, you're talking to me when you're trying to buy a suit for your child. And these conversations we can have later. So we've got to slow down, and you need to do it. And I'm actually not even going to take your call if it's not urgent. You know, and there we go. And I said, you know what, thank you. I appreciate you checking me on that. And so I said, and I'm going to be in Montgomery with my kids. My children came with me to Montgomery, which was great, and my husband. And so on Friday, I said, I'm taking off the day. I'm not checking email, and I'm going to be with my family, and we're going to the legacy museums that were down there, and it was really important. And the legacy museums were extraordinary. There was so much, and we'll talk about that later. But one of the things they had was a giant wall filled of names from the 1870 census. So for the newly liberated, formerly enslaved people, all of them names were on the census, and they had everybody's name on this wall. And we went and we found our names, found Caders, we found the Frasers, we found the Poinsetts, and it was so impactful and meaningful. And I did that, and I had that, and I left the park, and then there was a message on my signal from my boss who was like, I promised you I wasn't going to call, but there's an emergency. And I was like, okay. So you know what I mean? It was really funny. I said, I thought I was supposed to take a break. What happened? But she's like, I wouldn't if it wasn't important. But it's really bringing those two concepts together and respecting it and being open with each other and bobbing and weaving and ebbing and flowing when we can. So I think that I am a better parent for having been a public defender. I'm such a better lawyer for having been a parent. I'm such a better negotiator for having been a wife. Anybody in here married? I don't see a bifurcation of work-life balance. I instead just see a merging of this in the short time we're on this earth and making the most out of it.
Well, that's fantastic. And hard to achieve,
Well, it's just one imbalance to another.
Yeah, it is, and I like the flexibility and the moving. Yeah. We have time now for questions from you all. So on topics that we've touched on or that haven't been touched on but that you are curious about, just please go up to the microphone with your question.
And be in conversation.
Yes.
And be in conversation, yeah.
Is this on? Okay, awesome. Thank you for being here today. I've really enjoyed hearing you speak. Throughout the conversation, you've talked a lot about your belief in principles, whether that was the Skokie case or standing up for the sake of principles. And so I'm curious, when you deal with a loss, or in your career, when you were a public defender, when you've dealt with a loss, sometimes that's felt very acutely and in front of you between, a defendant that you really felt was innocent, and you can see the emotional harm there. And so I'm curious, just A, how you process the losses, and B, whether your belief and how your belief in those principles kind of interacts with how you process, if at all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it isn't just there are cases that I lost that I shouldn't have. And because, I usually didn't think about innocence or guilt as much as I thought about, did the government prove its case? Did they have the evidence? But I did have a couple of innocent clients, and that was really difficult when it takes it out of the construct of the government's burden, and it puts it in a place that you're referring to of just injustice, just rank injustice. And I also did a lot of sentencing work, and so while a judge's sentence might have been permissible, it felt so unjust. And I'll never forget one of my clients who was 17, and he was accused, he was tried as an adult. And I watched him, we lost the case, and I watched him going back into the lockup, and he got a 40-year sentence. And he was a child, and I wanted to quit. And I remember I was in the courtroom, and I was with my co-counsel, and I started to tear up. And she grabbed my arm, not nicely, and she gripped it, and she said, "Don't you dare, do not pull it together." And I got back to the office, and I fell apart. And it just being a part of a system that would enable that to happen, it just felt so wrong and unjust, and I really questioned if I should stay there, and the emotion still is so real. But again, I think about the shoulders that I'm standing on. I think about all of the people who, in the trajectory of progress in such a short time that this country has had, and now we're having threat of going backwards. But I think about all of the people and all of the sacrifice and all of the ways that people were resilient, that it inspires me and makes me feel a sense of obligation. After the election, I did not want, personally, I work for a nonpartisan organization, and I believe very much in nonpartisanship, and you can imagine I wasn't so excited about the way this turned out. There was a lot of people, especially in my community, who were because there was a lot of discussion of, Black women have carried this party for so long. We call ourselves the 92%, because 92% of Black women voted for the Democratic candidate. We're done. We've tried, we've worked, we're done. And I found that really challenging personally, because I'm like, no, we're not. And how dare we? We can't be done. Yes, we're tired, but there's so much to do. And so I think that the ways that I personally reckon with feeling like facing something that is unjust despite the rules is looking at all of those who believed in the rules and fought for them, and looking at all the progress that has been made, that we just have to keep going. I really do believe also, I believe hope is a strategy. There is a saying, a famous saying, that hope is not a strategy. We were talking about this last night. I believe it is a strategy. If you can envision it, then you can see a strategy and the steps to get to it. But if you can't envision it, then what? I don't know. What do you think?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I was, I thought, especially at the beginning of your talk, you talked about, well, you mentioned Frederick Douglass's 1895 speech, and the idea of persevering and standing up when others have stood up before. And I think hope, I mean, it's a fuel for that preparation. It's a fuel for wanting to win the next case. So You know, for me, it might be more an anxiety, but, you know, I still think it's kind of that same kind of energy that gets you going. So, that's what I say. Thank you.
I think we have one more question over here.
So I know you'd mentioned like coalition building, especially in this time. I kind of see a coalition kind of in the opposite. Like when I look to the right, I see people wanting to destroy institutions, and the people that don't get crushed under the weight of MAGA. But on the left, there's also kind of a far left hatred of the institution for good reasons, but you know, to the point where they think it's unfixable. And I don't really see anyone standing up for an institution besides, I guess you'd say like moderate Democrats. So I'm wondering, how does the ACL deal with staying staying strong in a time where kind of everyone, there's no sticking up for the institution? We have the left and right kind of hating on it.
I think it's such a great analysis of questioning of institutions from multiple angles. But there is a strong middle. And there is, you know, what we're seeing right now is, and this is where I think this is in some ways the definition of responsible wielding of power. You know, when we stood up for the NRA, you know, that was controversial for many on the left, but it was something that we did despite the weight, because of the reasons that I stated before. And what we're seeing, for example, right now, in the most recent case of Columbia University student whose green card is being threatened because of speech activities, is a real organization of free speech advocates on the right who are coming forward and standing up in that case. We see free speech organizations of a lot of conservative Jewish organizations who are standing up and saying, no, 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 not in my name, not today. That is not what we're going to do. So I think that there are a lot of critiques of institutionalism from both places. But I think, you know, my question often for those anti-institutionalists is, so then what? Especially on the left, on the far, you know, it's like, you know, the critique of the institutionalism, the theory of anarchy, for example. What instead? What's the alternative? What are you talking about building? You know, there's a real, in the criminal legal system movement, right, there's a real critique in the movement itself of taking away, of so much of the movement talking about, well, we're gonna decarcerate, we're gonna this, anything with a D in front of it, right? Well, what are you talking about building instead? And I think that's a fair critique of those places, and a fair critique of anti-institutionalism is, well, so then what instead?
Yasmin, thank you so much for being here today. A little known fact that I learned last night, Yasmin's father-in-law was a basketball coach here, and your husband lived in Champaign. He sure did. For a bit of time, so it's a homecoming of sorts.
Oh,
I
got a question. Did you see the golf course behind the stadium?
But we thank everyone who's joined us today in person on our line. For those in attendance, please feel free to come up and visit with Yasmin afterwards. We have a token of appreciation, I believe, under the podium. I will get to you as soon as we are done. But thank you, and I wanted to have all of us join me in thanking you for being here today. It was supposed to be here.
Is it not there?
I don't know where. And that's why I didn't go up here.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. Maybe Hannah has it. I will grab it for you. And I have to reset it. Oh, here, it's,
The subject matter is great. I enjoyed that too, but I just enjoyed that they're actually engaging sort of presentations. It worked really well. Yeah, I didn't know how it would go. Yeah, I mean, she was great. She got so much to say.
I also, I think you mentioned like trial level public defender office and also like federal defender. Oh, trial. Or in the federal system. Yes, state court. Yeah. Is there? I was wanting to talk about the differences between the state court system versus federal court for being a public defender. If there's challenges you see like one of those.
I guess I believe that. I believe that. After seeing her talk for a while, I did that.
Okay, yeah. I really appreciate you answering that question. Yeah, it was great to